The stagecoach lurched violently to the left as gunshots cracked through the dry Texas air, and Diana Dawson felt her heart slam against her ribs as masked men on horseback surrounded them like wolves circling wounded prey. It was late August in 1878, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail between San Antonio and Fort Stockton, turning the inside of the coach into an oven. Diana had been traveling for 3 days now, her dark hair plastered to her neck with sweat, her modest traveling dress clinging uncomfortably to her frame. She pressed herself against the worn leather seat as the driver shouted something unintelligible from above, his voice thick with panic. "Everyone out! Now!" The command came from a tall man on a bay horse, his face covered by a red bandana, his revolver pointed directly at the coach door. His voice shook slightly, not with fear exactly, but with something else. Desperation, maybe. Rage. Diana's fellow passengers, an elderly couple named Henderson and a portly merchant who had introduced himself as Mr. Pemberton, scrambled toward the door. Diana followed on trembling legs, lifting her skirts to step down onto the hard, packed earth. The heat rising from the ground made her dizzy, or perhaps that was the fear coursing through her veins. "We do not have time for this," another robber hissed, pulling his horse closer. This one was shorter, stockier, his hands gripping his weapon so tightly his knuckles showed white even through the dust coating his skin. "They will be coming after us." "Shut up, Frank," the tall one snapped. He gestured with his gun toward the passengers. "Valuables, everything you have got. Watches, rings, money, put it in the bag." The third robber, a lean man with nervous eyes visible above his bandana, rode forward with a burlap sack. His horse danced sideways, picking up on his rider's anxiety. "We should not be doing this," he muttered. "This was not the plan." "The plan went to hell when that train got delayed in Del Rio," the tall one said through gritted teeth. "We have been sitting in those rocks for 2 days waiting. We have nothing. No money, no supplies, nothing. We need something." Diana's mind raced as she fumbled with the small locket at her throat. These were not professional outlaws. That much was clear from their disorganization, their arguing, the way they kept looking over their shoulders toward the eastern horizon. They had planned to rob a train, she realized. Something had gone wrong, and now they were desperate enough to stop a simple stagecoach. Mr. Pemberton dropped his pocket watch into the bag with shaking hands. Mrs. Henderson was crying softly as her husband removed his wedding band. Diana unclasped her locket, the only thing of value she owned. It had belonged to her mother, and inside was a tiny photograph of her parents on their wedding day. She felt tears prick her eyes as she let it fall into the sack. "Please," she heard herself say, "that is all I have of her." The tall robber's eyes met hers for a moment, and she saw something flicker there. Regret, perhaps. But then he looked away, hardening his expression. "Should have thought about that before traveling through Texas." A shot rang out from somewhere in the rocky hills to the north, and all 3 robbers jerked their horses around. Diana's breath caught in her throat. The sound had been different from the robbers' initial shots, deeper, more deliberate. The echo rolled across the scrubland like thunder. "Someone is up there," Frank said, his voice rising. "I told you this was a bad idea. I told you we should have just headed for Mexico." "Quiet," the tall one ordered, but his gun hand wavered. Another shot, this one striking the ground near the horse's hooves. The animals reared and whinnied, and the nervous robber nearly lost his seat. Diana saw the driver and his shotgun guard crouched on top of the coach, both men looking toward the hills with expressions of confusion and hope mingled together. Then he appeared, emerging from between 2 massive boulders like something out of legend. He was on foot, moving with a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. Diana's first impression was of sheer magnitude, of raw physical power barely contained. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders so broad they blocked out the sun behind him. His hair, a dark brown shot through with lighter streaks from sun exposure, fell past his collar in waves. He wore buckskin trousers and a worn cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. A rifle rested easily in his large hands, pointed at the ground, but ready to rise in an instant. "That is far enough," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance with natural authority. It was a deep voice, rough around the edges like whiskey and smoke. "You boys are making a mistake." The tall robber swung his horse around fully, training his revolver on the newcomer. "This is none of your concern, friend. Ride on." "Cannot do that." The mountain man, for that was surely what he was, took another step forward. His eyes, Diana saw as he drew closer, were a striking gray blue, the color of storm clouds over the desert. They swept over the scene with quick intelligence, taking in the frightened passengers, the nervous robbers, the situation's volatility. "You're going to put down those weapons, return what you took, and ride away while you still can." Frank laughed, but it sounded hysterical. "There are 3 of us and 1 of you. Do the math." I did. The mountain man's expression did not change. "That is why I am giving you the chance to leave." In the tense silence that followed, Diana found she could not look away from him. There was something compelling about his stillness, the way he stood as though rooted to the earth itself. He did not look afraid, did not even look particularly concerned. He looked like a man who had been through hard things and survived them, like someone who understood exactly what he was capable of. The tall robber's hand tightened on his gun. "We need this money. We have been waiting for that train for weeks. We left our gang to do this job on our own, and now we have nothing to show for it. We are taking what is in that bag." "No," the mountain man said simply. "You are not." What happened next occurred so quickly that Diana would later struggle to recall the exact sequence of events. The nervous robber moved first, swinging his pistol toward the mountain man. But the big man was faster than seemed possible for someone his size. His rifle came up in one fluid motion, and he fired. The shot was precise, striking the nervous robber's gun and sending it spinning from his hand with a yelp of pain and surprise. Before the other 2 could react, the mountain man had closed the distance with startling speed. He reached up and grabbed Frank by his vest, hauling him clean off his horse with one hand. The stocky robber hit the ground hard, his gun flying from his grip. The mountain man kicked it away, then turned to face the tall robber, who was frantically trying to aim while controlling his spooked horse. "Do not," the mountain man warned, but fear and desperation made men foolish. The tall robber fired, the shot going wild as his horse reared. The mountain man moved with that same economical grace, stepping aside and then forward. He caught the horse's bridle, speaking something low and calm that Diana could not hear. The animal settled almost immediately, as if recognizing a kindred spirit. The tall robber tried to aim again, but the mountain man's hand shot out, gripping the man's wrist with enough force that he cried out and dropped the weapon. In seconds, all 3 robbers were disarmed and standing in a row, the mountain man covering them with his rifle, while the nervous one cradled his bruised hand. "Driver," the mountain man called out, not taking his eyes off the would-be thieves. "You've got rope up there?" "Yes, sir," the driver answered, his voice thick with relief and amazement. "Tie these 3 up. Make it tight." As the driver and his guard scrambled down to comply, the mountain man finally lowered his rifle slightly. His gaze swept over the passengers, pausing when it reached Diana. Their eyes met, and she felt something shift in her chest, like a key turning in a lock she had not known existed. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw concern there, a silent question asking if she was all right. She managed a small nod, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his weathered face before he looked away. The nervous robber, now that the immediate danger had passed, seemed to find his tongue. "You do not understand. We have been riding with the Morrison gang for 2 years. When they find out what happened here, they will come for you. They will come for all of you." "Morrison gang is finished," the mountain man said flatly. "Rangers caught up with them outside El Paso 3 weeks ago. Most of them are in jail or dead. I heard about it in Fort Davis." The color drained from the tall robber's face. "That cannot be right. Jake Morrison is too smart to get caught. Jake Morrison's too dead to care about being smart anymore. Got himself shot trying to escape." The mountain man watched as the driver finished binding the 3 men. "You boys picked the wrong profession." With the robbers secured, he turned his attention to the burlap sack. He picked it up and brought it to the passengers, his movements unhurried. Up close, Diana could see the small scars that marked his hands and forearms, the evidence of a hard life lived outdoors. He smelled of leather and pine and something else, something wild and clean like mountain air. "I believe this belongs to you folks," he said, his voice gentler now. Mr. Pemberton reclaimed his watch with effusive thanks. The Hendersons retrieved their rings, Mrs. Henderson openly weeping with relief. When it came to Diana's turn, she reached into the bag and found her locket. Her fingers trembled as she fastened it back around her neck. "Thank you," she said, looking up at him. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his beard. He was perhaps 30 or 32, she guessed, though the sun and wind had weathered him in a way that made exact age difficult to determine. "You saved us." He shook his head slightly. "Just did what needed doing, miss. Nevertheless, we are grateful." She hesitated, then extended her hand. "Diana Dawson." He looked at her hand for a moment, as if surprised by the formal gesture, then engulfed it gently in his own. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip careful despite his obvious strength. "William Thorne, madam. Folks call me Will." "Well, Mr. Thorne, you have my deepest thanks." She found she did not want to let go of his hand, which was ridiculous. She had only just met the man. He released her hand slowly, and she thought she saw a flicker of reluctance in his eyes that matched her own feeling. "You heading to Fort Stockton?" "Yes. I'm to be the new schoolteacher there. I was supposed to arrive yesterday, but the stage was delayed in San Antonio." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger. "Teacher, are you? That's good. Town needs more learning." The driver approached, clearing his throat. "Mr. Thorne, we cannot thank you enough. What do you want us to do with these fellows?" Will turned to consider the three bound men. They looked pathetic now, all their bravado gone, sitting in the dust with their heads down. "Fort Stockton has got a sheriff, does it not?" "Yes, sir. Sheriff Rawlings. Good man. Take them there. Let him sort it out." Will glanced at the angle of the sun, which had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. "You have got maybe 4 hours of daylight left. You should make town before full dark if you push." The driver nodded, then hesitated. "Will you be riding with us? Protection like?" Will shook his head. "I have got camp up in those hills, my horse is in gear. But I will follow along at a distance, make sure you folks get where you're going safely." "You have our gratitude, Mr. Thorne," Mr. Pemberton said, pumping Will's hand vigorously. "If there is anything I can do for you when we reach Fort Stockton, anything at all, you have only to ask. Appreciate that." Will's eyes drifted back to Diana, lingering for a moment before he stepped back. "Best get moving. Day is wasting." The bound robbers were loaded unceremoniously onto the top of the coach, much to their vocal displeasure. The passengers climbed back inside, Diana taking her seat by the window. As the stage lurched into motion, she looked out to see Will standing where they had left him, watching them go. He raised one hand in a brief farewell, and she found herself pressing her palm against the glass in response. "Remarkable man," Mrs. Henderson said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Simply remarkable." "Indeed," her husband agreed. "Men like that are what made this country. Strong, capable, not afraid to do what is right." Mr. Pemberton launched into speculation about Will's background, but Diana barely heard him. She kept her eyes on the landscape outside, occasionally catching glimpses of a figure moving through the rocks and scrub alongside their path. Will was keeping his word, watching over them from a distance. The knowledge made her feel safer than she had since leaving Philadelphia 3 weeks ago. The sun was painting the western sky in shades of orange and pink when Fort Stockton finally appeared on the horizon. The town was larger than Diana had expected, a collection of adobe and wooden buildings clustered around a central plaza. The old fort itself, which had given the town its name, sat on a rise overlooking everything, though it had been abandoned by the military 5 years earlier. The settlement had grown up around it, serving ranchers, travelers, and traders moving through this section of West Texas. The stage rolled down the main street, drawing attention from the townspeople. By the time they reached the sheriff's office, a small crowd had gathered. Sheriff Rawlings, a lean man in his 50s with a drooping mustache and keen eyes, emerged to meet them. The driver wasted no time explaining what had happened. As he talked, occasionally interrupted by Mr. Pemberton's embellishments, the sheriff's expression grew more interested. When he heard about Will Thorne's intervention, he actually smiled. "Will is back in these parts, is he? That's good to hear. Good man, that one." "You know him?" Diana asked, stepping down from the coach with the help of the guard. "Know of him mostly. He passes through now and again. trading furs and sometimes doing guide work. Lives up in the mountains most of the time, keeps to himself. But folks around here speak highly of him. Helped out a rancher last spring when rustlers were hitting his herd. Tracked them down without any fuss." The sheriff gestured to his deputies. "Get these fellows locked up. We will sort out what to do with them tomorrow." As the bound robbers were hauled away, still protesting their treatment, Diana looked back toward the edge of town. The sun had nearly set now, the last light painting the rocky hills in deep purple and gold. She wondered where Will was, whether he had already turned back to his camp in the mountains. "Miss Dawson," a woman's voice pulled her attention around. "I am Eleanor Pritchard, the mayor's wife. We have been expecting you. Come, let me show you to your lodgings." Diana forced herself to focus. She was here to teach, to build a new life far from Philadelphia and the painful memories she had left behind. A chance encounter with a mountain man, no matter how striking, was not part of her plans. But as Mrs. Pritchard led her down the street toward a modest house behind the schoolhouse, Diana found her thoughts returning again and again to storm-cloud eyes and gentle, calloused hands. The next morning dawned clear and hot. Diana woke in her new quarters, a small but clean room in the house that belonged to the schoolteacher before her, who had returned east to marry. The furniture was simple but serviceable: a bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a desk by the window. She could see the schoolhouse from here, a one-room building that would be her domain come the start of term in 2 weeks. She dressed carefully in a simple gray day dress and pinned her dark hair up in a practical bun. Looking in the small mirror above the washstand, she saw what she always saw: a face that was pleasant enough but not beautiful, brown eyes that held too much sadness for someone only 22 years old, a mouth that had forgotten how to smile easily. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Pritchard with a basket covered in cloth. "Good morning, dear. I thought you might like some breakfast, and then I can show you the school properly." Over fresh bread and preserves, Mrs. Pritchard filled Diana in on the town's particulars. Fort Stockton had about 400 permanent residents, with another 100 or so scattered on ranches in the surrounding area. The school currently had 27 students enrolled, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. The last teacher, Miss Morrison, she did her best, but I will confess, she was not particularly enthusiastic about the position. She spent most of her time writing letters to her intended back in Virginia. Mrs. Pritchard gave Diana an appraising look. "But Mayor Pritchard corresponded with your references in Philadelphia. Your former headmaster spoke very highly of your dedication and ability." Diana felt a familiar pang at the mention of Philadelphia, but she pushed it aside. "I am grateful for the opportunity. Teaching is my calling." They spent the morning at the schoolhouse, taking inventory of supplies and books. Diana was pleased to find a decent collection of primers and readers, though the arithmetic texts were outdated and there were no maps to speak of. She made notes of what would need to be ordered. Around midday, as they were organizing the small library shelf, the schoolhouse door opened. Diana looked up to see Sheriff Rawlings, and with him, his hat in his hands and looking decidedly uncomfortable in the enclosed space, was Will Thorne. Diana's heart gave an unexpected leap. In the brighter light of day, Will looked even more imposing than he had on the trail. He had cleaned up somewhat, his face washed and his hair tied back, but he still radiated that sense of wild places barely contained by civilization. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorway. "Pardon the interruption, ladies," the sheriff said. "Miss Dawson, Mr. Thorne here came by the office this morning to give his account of yesterday's events. Thought he might want to check that you folks were all settled safely." "That's very kind," Diana said, finding her voice. "We are quite well, thanks in no small part to Mr. Thorne." Will turned his hat in his hands, his eyes meeting hers briefly before skittering away. "Glad to hear it, madam. Just wanted to make sure." An awkward silence fell. Mrs. Pritchard looked between them with undisguised interest, and the sheriff seemed to be hiding a smile behind his mustache. "Well," Mrs. Pritchard said brightly, "it is nearly noon and quite hot. Mr. Thorne, would you care to join us for dinner? It is the least we can do after your heroic actions yesterday." Will started to shake his head. "That is kind, madam, but I have already imposed enough—" "Nonsense," Mrs. Pritchard said firmly. "I insist. Miss Dawson is new to town and could use friendly faces, and you saved her life yesterday. It would be my pleasure to feed you a proper meal." Diana found herself adding, "Please do join us, Mr. Thorne. I would like to thank you properly." His eyes met hers again, and this time they held. She saw conflict there, the instinct of a solitary man warring against something else. Finally, he nodded slowly. "If it is not too much trouble." "No trouble at all. Come to our house in an hour. You remember where it is, Sheriff?" "Yes, madam." After they left, Mrs. Pritchard turned to Diana with barely suppressed excitement. "That man is quite something, is he not? I have heard of him but never met him properly before. They say he can track anything that moves, that he once fought off a mountain lion with just a knife." Diana felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He certainly seems very capable." "Capable, Mrs. Pritchard repeated with a knowing smile. "Yes, that is one word for it." The dinner at the Pritchard house was a surprisingly pleasant affair. The mayor himself, a jovial man with the expanding waistline and genuine warmth, joined them along with Sheriff Rawlings. Will was clearly uncomfortable at first. His large frame perched carefully on a dining chair that seemed too delicate for him, his manners overly formal, as if he was afraid of doing something wrong. But as the meal progressed and the conversation flowed, he began to relax. Diana found herself fascinated by the glimpses of his life that emerged. He had been living in the mountains for nearly 8 years, trapping and hunting, occasionally guiding parties through the difficult terrain. Before that, he had been a scout for the army. "Why did you leave?" Diana asked, then immediately worried she had overstepped. But Will did not seem offended. He was quiet for a moment, his fork paused over his plate. "Too much killing," he said finally. "Too many orders that did not sit right with my conscience. I wanted peace and quiet, wanted to live by my own rules. Do you not get lonely?" The question escaped before she could stop it. His eyes found hers across the table. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But alone is not the same as lonely. Mountains have their own kind of company." Mayor Pritchard cleared his throat. "Well, Mr. Thorne, we are mighty glad you were in the area yesterday. Those robbers could have caused real harm. Speaking of which, Sheriff, what is the plan with them?" "Sent a wire to San Antonio this morning. Marshal is sending a deputy to collect them day after tomorrow. They will stand trial there." The sheriff helped himself to more potatoes. "They sang like birds once they were in a cell, confirmed what Will said about the Morrison gang being broken up. These 3 were trying to make a name for themselves, but they bungled everything from the start." "Fools," the mayor said, shaking his head. "Could have gotten themselves and innocent people killed." After dinner, as Mrs. Pritchard served coffee, Will stood and stretched, wincing slightly. "Are you hurt?" Diana asked immediately. "Just stiff. Not as young as I used to be." He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and almost boyish. "Too many nights sleeping on hard ground." "Perhaps you should stay in town for a few days," Mrs. Pritchard suggested. "We have a boarding house that is quite comfortable." Will shook his head. "Appreciate the thought, madam, but I have got my camp set up in the hills. Need to check my trap lines." "When will you next be in town?" Diana asked, then felt her cheeks heat again. Why did she keep asking him personal questions? But Will did not seem to mind. "Hard to say. Usually come through every couple of months for supplies, sometimes more often if the hunting is good and I have furs to trade." 2 months is a long time, she heard herself say. Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. "I suppose it is," he said quietly. The sheriff stood, breaking the moment. "Well, I should be getting back to the office. Will, you are welcome in Fort Stockton any time. You know that." "Appreciate it, Sheriff." They all moved toward the door, the evening winding down. Diana found herself walking beside Will, very aware of his presence, the way he moved, the subtle strength in every gesture. Outside, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The heat of the day was finally breaking, replaced by the cooler air that made Texas summer evenings bearable. Will turned to Diana, his hat in his hands again. "Miss Dawson, I hope your teaching goes well. Those kids are lucky to have someone who cares about learning." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne, and thank you again for yesterday. I do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." "You would have been fine," he said with quiet certainty. "You strike me as someone who survives." "What makes you say that?" He considered the question. "Your eyes. They have seen hard things, but you are still standing, still moving forward. That takes strength. His perception surprised her, touched something deep inside that she'd been trying to keep buried. I could say the same about you. They stood there for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. Finally, Will settled his hat on his head. Take care of yourself, Miss Dawson. You as well, Mr. Thorne. He nodded to the others, then walked down the street toward the edge of town where his horses were stabled. Diana watched him go until Mrs. Pritchard gently touched her arm. Come, dear. Let me walk you back to your quarters. That night, lying in her bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Diana stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to her. She had come to Texas to escape, to start over, to leave behind the suffocating expectations and the man who had broken her heart by choosing wealth and status over love. She was not looking for romance, was not ready for it. But something about Will Thorne had reached past her carefully constructed walls. Perhaps it was the quiet strength he carried, or the gentleness that lurked beneath his intimidating exterior. Perhaps it was the way he had looked at her, really looked at her, seeing more than just a proper young lady from the East. She touched the locket at her throat, thinking of her mother, who had died when Diana was 15. Her mother would have liked Will, she thought, would have appreciated his honesty, his lack of pretension. Stop being foolish, she whispered to herself. You just met the man. He lives in the mountains. You are a school teacher. This makes no sense. But her heart, it seemed, was not particularly interested in sense. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity as Diana prepared for the start of school. She met families, learned names, familiarized herself with the town and its rhythms. Fort Stockton was rougher than Philadelphia, certainly, but there was a warmth here, a sense of community that she had not expected. People looked out for each other, helped without being asked, treated her with respect and curiosity. She tried not to think about Will Thorne. Tried, and mostly failed. The school year began on a Monday morning in early September. Diana stood at the front of the classroom as 27 children filed in, their faces ranging from eager to suspicious to bored. She took a breath and smiled. Good morning, my name is Miss Dawson, and I am very happy to be your teacher. A hand shot up belonging to a freckled boy of about 10. Is it true you were almost robbed by outlaws and a mountain man saved you? Diana blinked, then could not help but laugh. Yes, that is true. But let us save story time for after we have done some proper learning, shall we? The days fell into a rhythm. Diana discovered she loved teaching even more than she had expected. The children were bright and curious, though some were behind where they should be in their studies. She worked extra hours with those who struggled, and she pushed those who were ahead. In the evenings, she took walks around town, enjoying the coolness after the heat of the day. Sometimes she found herself looking toward the mountains, wondering where exactly Will was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about her. 3 weeks after school started, Diana was in the general store ordering supplies when she overheard 2 ranchers talking near the counter. Saw Will Thorne up near Comanche Creek yesterday, one said. He was tracking something, looked serious. Trouble? The other asked. Did not say, but he had that look about him. You know the one. Diana's heart quickened. Will was nearby. She told herself it did not matter, that she had no reason to hope he might come to town. But that evening, as she was leaving the schoolhouse after grading papers, she looked up to find him standing by the hitching post, holding the reins of 2 horses. Her breath caught. He looked road-worn, his clothes dusty, but his eyes were as striking as she remembered. They lit up when he saw her. Miss Dawson, he said, his deep voice sending a pleasant shiver through her. Hope I'm not disturbing you. Not at all. She walked toward him, trying to keep her pace sedate when what she really wanted to do was run. I heard you were in the area. A slight smile tugged at his mouth. News travels fast. It does in small towns. She stopped a few feet away, suddenly shy. What brings you to Fort Stockton? Needed some supplies, and he hesitated, looking almost uncertain. Wanted to see how you were settling in. Warmth bloomed in her chest. That's kind of you. I'm settling in very well. The children are wonderful. I'm glad. He shifted his weight, and she realized he was nervous. Will Thorne, who had faced down 3 armed men without breaking a sweat, was nervous talking to her. I was wondering, if you are not too busy, if you might like to take a walk. Evening is nice. I would like that very much. They fell into step together, walking toward the edge of town. The sun was setting, painting everything in warm gold. Diana was very aware of Will beside her, the way he shortened his naturally long stride to match hers, the way he positioned himself between her and the street. "How are the trap lines?" she asked. "Good. Been a productive season." He glanced at her. "How is teaching?" "Challenging but rewarding. I have one student, a girl named Sarah, who is remarkably bright. She reads at a level well beyond her age. I'm trying to find more advanced books for her." "That's good. World needs more educated women." He said it matter-of-factly, as if it were obvious, and Diana felt another piece of her heart shift toward him. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, leaving the town behind and following a well-worn path that led to a small creek. The water ran low this time of year, but it still burbled pleasantly over smooth stones. "Can I ask you something?" Will said finally. "Of course. What brought you to Texas? Woman, with your education, your manner of speaking, you are from money, from a life a lot easier than this." He held up a hand quickly. "Not trying to pry, but there is a story there, and if I am speaking out of turn, just tell me to mind my own business." Diana sat down on a large flat rock near the water, and after a moment, Will joined her. She was quiet for a time, gathering her thoughts. "I was engaged," she said finally, "to a man named Charles Whitmore. He came from a very prominent Philadelphia family. My father worked for his father's banking firm. It was considered an excellent match." "But you did not love him," Will said quietly. "I thought I did. Or maybe I loved who I thought he was." She picked up a small stone and tossed it into the water. "When my father lost his position after the firm had some financial troubles, Charles broke the engagement. He said his family could not be associated with scandal, even though my father had done nothing wrong. He just was not important enough to protect. I am sorry. I am not. Not anymore." She looked at Will, finding understanding in his eyes. "It showed me who he truly was, and it showed me that I needed to make my own way, be my own person. When the position here was advertised, I applied immediately. My father did not want me to go, but my mother, before she died, always told me to choose courage over comfort." Will was quiet for a moment. "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Diana touched her locket. "She would have liked you." "What makes you say that?" "She valued honesty, integrity. She always said you could judge a person's character by how they treated those who could do nothing for them. You saved us that day, not because you wanted reward or recognition, but because it was right. I did what anyone should do. But not everyone would have. That matters." The sun had set fully now, stars beginning to emerge. They sat together in the growing darkness, and Diana felt a peace she had not known in months, maybe years. "I should get you back to town," Will said, though he did not sound eager to move. "Not proper for a schoolteacher to be out after dark with a rough man like me." "I trust you," Diana said simply. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight, his eyes were very bright. "You barely know me." "I know enough." She met his gaze steadily. "I know you are good and kind and brave. I know you respect me. That is more than I knew after months of courting Charles." "Diana," he said, her name rough on his tongue. It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it sent warmth through her. "I am not the kind of man someone like you should be interested in. I live alone in the mountains. I have no property, no prospects. I'm gone for months at a time. You deserve better." "Should you not let me decide what I deserve?" She found herself leaning closer to him. "Will, I came to Texas to start a new life, to find out who I am without all the expectations and rules that governed me before. I'm not looking for another Charles Whitmore. I'm not looking for society balls and calling cards." "What are you looking for?" "Something real, something honest." She took a breath. "Someone who sees me." He raised one large hand slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, and cupped her cheek. His palm was warm and rough, and she leaned into the touch. "I see you," he said quietly. "From the moment I saw you standing by that stagecoach, trying to be brave even though you were terrified. I have not been able to stop thinking about you." "Then why did you wait 3 weeks to come back?" A rueful smile touched his lips. "Trying to be noble, trying to convince myself that you would forget about me, move on, find someone suitable." "And how did that work?" "Terribly." He stroked his thumb across her cheekbone. Every day I thought about you, wondered if you were happy, if you were safe, wanted to hear your voice, see your smile. I have never felt this way before. It scares me a little. I am scared too, she admitted. But I'm also tired of running from things that scare me, tired of playing it safe. Diana, if we do this, if we try this, it will not be easy. My life is not easy. And people will talk. Let them talk. She covered his hand with her own. I want to try. I want to know you better, to see where this goes. Do you? For answer, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. They sat like that for a long moment, breathing the same air, the connection between them almost palpable. Yes, he finally said. Yes, I want to try. When they kissed, it was gentle and sweet, nothing like the aggressive attentions Charles had subjected her to. Will kissed her as if she were precious, as if he had all the time in the world and wanted to savor every second. When they finally drew apart, Diana felt tears on her cheeks, but they were happy tears. I should really get you back now, Will said, his voice rough with emotion, before the gossips have both of us run out of town. She laughed and let him help her to her feet. They walked back toward Fort Stockton hand in hand, and Diana felt as if the stars were shining just for them. Over the following weeks, they navigated the beginning of their courtship with care. Will came to town more frequently than before, usually every few days. He always brought Diana something. Wildflowers he had picked on the trail, a perfectly smooth riverstone, once a beautiful hawk feather. They took walks together, always properly chaperoned, or at least in public view, though Diana found the restrictions increasingly frustrating. She wanted to know everything about him. They sat together on the porch of her quarters while the late September evenings cooled, and she coaxed stories from him. He had grown up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 boys. His parents had died of cholera when he was 16, and he and his brothers had scattered. He had drifted west, taken a job with the army, and eventually found his way to the mountains. "Do you ever see your brothers?" she asked one evening. "Not in years. Last I heard, Thomas was in California, John was ranching in Wyoming, and Michael was back east somewhere. We were never close after Ma and Pa died." He did not sound particularly sad about it, merely matter of fact. "What about you? Any siblings?" "An older sister, Catherine. She married a lawyer and lives in Boston. We write occasionally, but we were never very close either. She did not understand why I wanted to teach rather than focus on finding a husband." Will's arm was around her shoulders, and she leaned into his solid warmth. "Do you think she would understand now? About us?" "I do not know, but I do not particularly care." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I am happy, Will. Happier than I have been in a very long time." He smiled down at her, and she still felt that flutter in her chest whenever he looked at her that way. "Me too." The town, as Will had predicted, talked, but to Diana's surprise, most of the talk was positive. Mrs. Pritchard was openly delighted by the match, declaring that Diana was exactly what Will needed, and vice versa. Sheriff Rawlings gave Will a stern talking to about treating Diana right, which Will took with good grace. Mayor Pritchard expressed concern about propriety, but even he had to admit that they were conducting themselves with appropriate discretion. Not everyone approved. The minister's wife, Mrs. Calloway, made her disapproval clear, suggesting loudly at a church social that a respectable schoolteacher should not be keeping company with a man who lived like a savage. Diana, whose temper had been carefully controlled her entire life, surprised everyone, including herself, by responding coolly that Will Thorne was twice the gentleman of anyone she had known in so-called civilized society. And if Mrs. Calloway had an issue with Diana's personal life, she could take it up with the school board. The school board, consisting of Mayor Pritchard and 2 ranchers whose children Diana taught, unanimously supported her. Will, when he heard about the incident, was both amused and concerned. "You should not be making enemies on my account." "She is not an enemy. She is just a narrow-minded woman who judges what she does not understand." Diana squeezed his hand. "Besides, I meant what I said. You are a gentleman. I am a rough man who has spent the better part of a decade living alone in the wilderness. You are a man who treats me with respect and kindness, who listens when I talk, who values my mind as much as anything else. That is what a gentleman is, Will. Not fancy manners and calling cards." He pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "How did I get so lucky as to find you?" I think we found each other. As October arrived and the intense heat of summer finally broke, Will began to talk about the future. His trap lines would need to be checked regularly through the winter, but he was thinking about spending more time in Fort Stockton, maybe finding work as a guide or a scout. "I do not want to be away from you for months at a time," he told her one evening. They were sitting on a bench outside the schoolhouse, watching the sunset. "I'm thinking maybe I can build a cabin closer to town. Still far enough out to have space, but close enough that I can see you regular." Diana's heart soared. "You would do that? For you?" "Yes." He took her hand. "Diana, I know we have not been courting that long, but I'm sure of my feelings. I love you. I want a life with you if you will have me." Tears pricked her eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Not yet. Not proper to ask until we have known each other at least a few more months. But I am telling you my intentions. Asking if you could see yourself married to a man like me." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I can absolutely see that. I love you too, Will. I have loved you for weeks now." He kissed her then, and it was deeper than before, full of promise and heat. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "A few more months," Will said, his voice strained. "I can be patient for a few more months." "So can I," Diana agreed, though her body was very much disagreeing with that statement. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. 2 weeks later, on a crisp morning in late October, Diana was teaching geography when she heard shouting outside. She asked the older children to watch the younger ones and stepped out to see what was happening. A crowd had gathered near the saloon. Diana hurried over, her stomach tight with worry. She pushed through the onlookers to find Will in the center of the commotion, standing over 2 men who were lying on the ground, groaning. Sheriff Rawlings was there, his gun drawn, looking between Will and the downed men with an expression of concern. "What happened?" Diana asked. Will's face was hard, his eyes cold in a way she had never seen before. "These 2 were forcing themselves on one of the saloon girls. She said no. They did not listen. I made them listen." One of the men struggled to sit up, blood streaming from his nose. "He attacked us. We were just having fun, and this savage attacked us." "That is not what happened," a woman's voice called from the saloon's doorway. A young woman, probably no older than 20, with red hair and a tear-stained face, stood there. "They cornered me in the alley. Started tearing at my dress. I yelled for help and Mr. Thorne came running. He stopped them." Sheriff Rawlings holstered his gun. "That true, Will?" "Yes." "They pull weapons on you?" "One had a knife." Will pointed to a blade lying in the dirt several feet away. "I disarmed him." The sheriff looked at the 2 men, both of whom were clearly drunk even at this early hour. "You boys are going to spend a night in jail cooling off, and if I hear about you bothering any more of the ladies in this town, worker or otherwise, you will answer to me personally. Understood?" They nodded sullenly, and the sheriff's deputy hauled them away. The crowd began to disperse, but Diana stayed where she was. Will finally looked at her, and she saw worry in his eyes, as if he feared she would be frightened or disgusted by the violence. Instead, she walked to him and took his hand, right there in front of everyone. "Thank you for helping her." Something in his expression eased. "Could not just walk by. I know, it is one of the reasons I love you." That night, after school ended, Diana found the young woman from the saloon waiting for her. Up close, Diana could see she was even younger than she had first appeared, with shadows under her green eyes that spoke of hard living. "Miss Dawson, I am Ruby. Ruby Martin. I wanted to thank you." "Thank me? I did not do anything. Will is the one who helped you. You stood by him. You did not act like he did something shameful." Ruby twisted her hands together. "Most respectable women, they would have been horrified that a man touched women like me. But you treated me like I mattered." Diana felt her throat tighten. "You do matter. What those men did was wrong, no matter what your profession is." Ruby's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. And thank you for teaching. My little sister, she is in your class, Annie Martin. She talks about you all the time, about how kind you are, how much she is learning." Diana remembered Annie, a quiet girl with red hair and quick mind. "She's a wonderful student, very bright." "She's my reason for everything," Ruby's voice strengthened. "I work at the saloon so she can eat, have clothes, go to school. Our parents died 2 years ago, and there was no one to take us in. I do what I have to do to keep us alive." "That is admirable," Diana said quietly. "You are a good sister." "I am not good, but I try to do right by her." Ruby took a breath. "Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you to you and to Mr. Thorne. He is a good man. You are lucky." "I know I am." After Ruby left, Diana sat on the porch of her quarters and thought about the complicated realities of life here. In Philadelphia, she had lived in a world of rigid social boundaries where women like Ruby were ignored at best, scorned at worst. But here, life was harder, and sometimes surviving meant making difficult choices. Ruby was not a bad person. She was just someone doing her best in circumstances that offered few options. That evening, when Will came by, Diana told him about Ruby's visit. He listened, his arm around her shoulders. "That is a hard situation," he said. "I have known girls like Ruby. They do what they have to do, and society judges them for it. She is keeping her sister fed and in school. I cannot judge that." "That is because you are a good person, Diana." He kissed the top of her head. "It is one of the things I love about you. You see people. Really see them." "I learned from the best," she said, leaning into him. November brought cooler weather and preparations for the holiday season. Diana threw herself into planning a Christmas program for the school, getting the children excited about performing for their families. Will was around more often now, having set up a temporary camp just a few miles outside town while he scouted locations for a permanent cabin. They went riding together on Sundays after church, Will teaching Diana more about the land and its ways. She learned to read tracks, to identify edible plants, to understand the language of the wilderness. He was a patient teacher, never making her feel foolish for not knowing things. One Sunday in mid-November, they rode out to a beautiful spot where a natural spring fed into a clear pool surrounded by oak trees. Will spread out a blanket and they sat together, sharing the lunch Diana had packed. "This is perfect," she said, looking around. "It is so peaceful here. I found it a few weeks ago. Been thinking about it ever since." He was quiet for a moment, then took her hand. "Diana, I have been thinking. I know I said we should wait a proper time, but I do not want to wait anymore. Life is short, and I know what I want. I want you. I want to build a life with you." Her heart began to race. "Will." He shifted off the blanket and onto one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. When he opened it, she saw a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing elaborate but beautiful in its simplicity. "Diana Dawson, will you marry me? Will you be my wife? Let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy?" "Yes," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he was kissing her, and she was kissing him back, and nothing else mattered but this moment, this man, this perfect beginning to their future. When they returned to town that evening, they went straight to the Pritchards to share the news. Mrs. Pritchard squealed with delight and hugged them both. The mayor shook Will's hand vigorously and congratulated them. Within an hour, the entire town knew. The next few weeks passed in a blur of planning. They decided on a small ceremony in late December, right after the school's Christmas program. Diana would continue teaching, at least for now, and Will would build their cabin on the property near the spring. He had already filed a claim on the land, making it official. The school's Christmas program was a success, the children performing songs and recitations for a packed schoolhouse full of proud parents. Afterward, Diana stood at the front of the room with Will beside her, and they formally announced their engagement to the community. There was applause and well wishes, and even Mrs. Calloway managed a tight-lipped smile. Ruby was there with Annie, sitting in the back. She caught Diana's eye and mouthed, "Congratulations," and Diana smiled and nodded in return. The wedding took place on December 23rd, a crisp, clear day with brilliant blue skies. The ceremony was held in the small church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Diana wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Pritchard had helped her sew, with her mother's locket at her throat. Will wore new clothes, his hair neatly trimmed though still long enough to brush his collar. He looked nervous and handsome and wonderful. Sheriff Rawlings stood as best man, having formed a firm friendship with Will over the past months. Mrs. Pritchard was Diana's matron of honor. The minister, despite his wife's reservations, performed the ceremony with warmth and sincerity. When it came time for vows, Will took Diana's hands in his and spoke from the heart. "Diana, you changed my life the moment I saw you. You taught me that being alone is not the same as being whole. You made me want more than just surviving. You made me want to live. I promise to love you, protect you, stand by you, and cherish you for all the days I am given. You are my heart." Diana could barely speak through her tears. "Will, you saved me in more ways than you know. You saw me when I felt invisible. You valued me when I felt worthless. You showed me what real love looks like. I promise to love you, support you, walk beside you through whatever comes. You are my home." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and told Will he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was tender and full of promise. The congregation erupted in applause and cheers. The celebration afterward at the town hall lasted well into the evening. There was food and music and dancing. Will, despite claiming he did not dance, held Diana in his arms and moved with her around the floor, his eyes never leaving her face. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered honestly. As the evening wound down, they said their goodbyes and left the celebration hand in hand. Will had prepared a surprise for Diana, a small house on the edge of town that Sheriff Rawlings had let them use for their wedding night. It was not their cabin, which was still under construction, but it was private and comfortable. Will carried her over the threshold, making her laugh. Inside there was a fire burning in the hearth, and someone, probably Mrs. Pritchard, had left flowers and food for them. Thank you," Diana said, standing in the center of the room. "For all of this, for marrying me." Will crossed to her and cupped her face in his large hands. "Thank you for saying yes, for taking a chance on a rough mountain man. You are not rough. You are perfect." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "I love you. I love you too, so much." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, Will treating her with reverence and care, making sure she was comfortable and happy. Diana had been nervous, having heard frightening things from married women in Philadelphia, but with Will, it felt natural and right. He was patient and attentive, and by the time they fell asleep in each other's arms, Diana understood what true intimacy meant. They spent a week in that borrowed house, a brief honeymoon where they could just be together without the eyes of the town on them. Will cooked for her over the fire, simple but delicious meals. They talked for hours about everything and nothing. They made love and slept tangled together and woke to greet each day with joy. All too soon, the week ended and reality reasserted itself. Diana returned to teaching, and Will threw himself into finishing their cabin. He wanted it done before the coldest part of winter arrived. The cabin took shape quickly with help from some of the men in town who had come to respect and like Will. It was not large, but it was well built and sturdy, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area, a bedroom and a small loft that could serve as storage, or eventually as a child's room. Will built a large fireplace that would keep them warm through winter nights. There was a porch facing east, so they could watch the sunrise over the mountains. Diana helped as much as she could, fetching tools and offering suggestions. She was there the day Will hung the door, officially making it a home. "What do you think?" he asked, standing back to look at their work. "I think it is perfect." She took his hand. "I think we are perfect." They moved in at the end of January, and Diana adjusted to married life with surprising ease. She rose early to make breakfast before riding into town to teach. Will worked on improving their property, building a barn for the horses, clearing land for a garden come spring. In the evenings, they cooked together, talked about their days, sat by the fire reading, or simply enjoying each other's presence. Diana had never been happier. The cabin might be small and rough compared to the Philadelphia house she grew up in, but it was theirs. It was filled with love and laughter and the promise of a future together. As spring arrived and the harsh Texas winter released its grip, Diana began to feel different. She was tired more than usual, slightly queasy in the mornings. It took her a few weeks to realize what was happening, and when she did, she sat on the edge of their bed with her hand pressed to her stomach, feeling a mixture of joy and fear. That evening, when Will came in from working on the barn, She was sitting by the fire, her hands twisting in her lap. "Diana, what is wrong?" He was at her side immediately, kneeling before her, concern etched on his face. "Nothing is wrong, at least, I do not think so." She took a breath. "Will, I'm with child. We are going to have a baby." His eyes went wide, and for a moment he was absolutely still. Then a smile broke across his face like the sun emerging from clouds. "A baby? Truly?" "Yes, truly." He gathered her into his arms, holding her so gently as if she might break. "This is the best news, the very best. Are you happy?" "I'm terrified," she admitted, "and yes, I'm happy, so happy. I will take care of you, both of you, I promise." And he did. As Diana's pregnancy progressed through the spring and into summer, Will was attentive and careful, making sure she did not overwork herself, bringing her anything she needed or wanted. He built a cradle with his own hands, spending hours sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk. Diana continued teaching until June, when the school year ended. She would take the next term off, returning once the baby was older. The school board, again supported by Mayor Pritchard, agreed without hesitation. The baby came in late August, during a thunderstorm that rattled the cabin windows. The midwife, Mrs. Henderson from the Stagecoach so many months ago, attended the birth. Will stayed by Diana's side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement. When their son finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Will cut the cord with shaking hands. The midwife cleaned the baby and handed him to Diana, and she looked down at the tiny face and felt her heart expand in ways she never knew possible. "He is beautiful," Will said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are amazing, both of you." They named him James William Thorne, after Will's father. James had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray-blue eyes. He was healthy and strong, and from the moment he entered the world, he owned both his parents completely. Those first few months were exhausting and wonderful. Diana was grateful for Will's help. He had no qualms about changing diapers or walking the floor with James when he was fussy. He sang to his son in a deep, rumbling voice that never failed to calm the baby. "You are a natural father," Diana told him one night as she watched him rock James to sleep. "I have a good teacher," he said, smiling at her. As James grew, the cabin filled with the sounds of babyhood cries and coos and gurgles. Diana returned to teaching the following year, with Mrs. Henderson watching James during the day. It worked well, allowing Diana to continue her career while ensuring James was cared for. The years passed in a happy blur. James grew into a toddler, then a little boy, curious and energetic. Will taught him about the wilderness, taking him on gentle hikes, showing him animal tracks, teaching him to be respectful of the land. Diana taught him his letters and numbers, nurturing his bright mind. When James was 3, Diana discovered she was pregnant again. This time, a daughter arrived the following spring, born on a morning when wildflowers covered the meadow around their cabin. They named her Grace, after Will's mother, and she was the image of Diana with Will's fierce spirit. Their family was complete, and their life was full. Will had become a respected member of the community, serving occasionally as a guide and using his tracking skills to help ranchers find lost stock. Diana was beloved by her students, generations of children learning under her patient guidance. They had hard times, of course. There was the winter when Will was caught in a blizzard and did not come home for 3 days, leaving Diana nearly mad with worry. There was the summer when James fell from a tree and broke his arm, and Diana and Will held him between them while the doctor set the bone. There was the year the drought was so bad that their garden failed and money was tight. But through it all, they had each other. Their love, which had begun on a dusty trail with gunshots and fear, had deepened and strengthened into something unbreakable. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Will surprised Diana by taking her back to the place where he had proposed. They left the children with Mrs. Pritchard, who spoiled them shamelessly, and rode out to the spring. Everything was just as Diana remembered: the clear water, the oak trees, the sense of peace that permeated the place. "I wanted to bring you back here," Will said, spreading out a blanket just as he had all those years ago, "to tell you again how much I love you, how grateful I am that you said yes to a rough mountain man with nothing to offer but his heart." "You offered me everything," Diana said, taking his hands. "You offered me love and respect and partnership. You gave me a home, a family, a life beyond my wildest dreams. I would say yes 1,000 times over." He kissed her then, and it was just as sweet as their first kiss, just as full of promise and heat. "Here is to the next 10 years," he murmured against her lips, "and the 10 after that, and all the years we are given." "All of them," Diana agreed, "every single one." As they sat together watching the sunset over the Texas landscape, Diana thought about the journey that had brought her here. A stagecoach robbery that had seemed like a disaster had turned out to be the beginning of her greatest adventure. A chance encounter with a mountain man had become the love story of her life. She had come to Texas running from heartbreak, but she had found home. Not a place, exactly, though she loved their cabin in the town that had accepted her. Home was the man beside her, the children sleeping safe in town, the life they had built together through hard work and love. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new joys and challenges. James grew tall and strong like his father, eventually training to be a sheriff's deputy under the aging Sheriff Rawlings. Grace became a teacher like her mother, taking over Diana's position when Diana finally retired at 50. Will aged gracefully, his hair going silver, but his strength barely diminished. He still took trips into the mountains, though not as often or for as long. He preferred to be home with Diana, sitting on their porch in the evenings, watching the sunset together as they had done for decades. On their 40th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, James had married and had 3 children of his own. Grace had 2. Diana looked at Will across the crowded room and felt the same flutter in her chest she had felt the first time she saw him. He caught her looking and smiled, that same smile that still had the power to make her weak in the knees. He made his way through the crowd to her side and took her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That day on the trail, when you came out of nowhere and saved us all." "Best day of my life," he said without hesitation. "The day I met you." "Mine too." She squeezed his hand. "I was so scared. And then there you were. My mountain man." "Your husband," he corrected gently. "That too." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they stood like that while their family laughed and talked around them. They had built something beautiful together, something that would last beyond their own lives. Their children would tell their children about the mountain man who stopped a robbery and fell in love with a school teacher. The story would become family legend, embellished and romanticized with each telling. But the truth, Diana thought, was better than any story. The truth was that love could bloom in the most unexpected places. That courage sometimes meant taking a chance on someone different from what you planned. That home was not a place, but a person, and she had found hers. As the evening wound down and their family began to leave, Will and Diana stood on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own hands so many years ago. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss. "No regrets?" Will asked, as he sometimes did. "Not a single one," Diana answered, as she always did. "You?" "Only that I did not meet you sooner." He pulled her close. "But we have had a good life, Diana, a really good life." "The best," she agreed. They went inside together, to the home they had made, to the bed they had shared for 4 decades. And as they fell asleep in each other's arms, as they had done thousands of times before, they were grateful for every moment, every choice that had led them to each other. The stagecoach robbery that could have been a tragedy had instead been a gift. It had brought together 2 people who seemed impossibly different, a cultured schoolteacher from Philadelphia and a solitary mountain man from the wilds of Texas, and proved that sometimes the best love stories were the ones nobody saw coming. Years later, after Will passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, Diana would sit on their porch and remember. She would touch the locket at her throat, which now held photographs of Will and their children, and she would smile through her tears. He had given her the most precious gift, a lifetime of love, of being truly seen and valued. When Diana followed him 5 years later, Grace found a letter her mother had written, meant to be read after her death. In it, Diana had written about that day on the trail, about seeing Will emerge from the rocks like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. She wrote about their life together, every joy and sorrow, every moment that had made up their years. But the last line was what Grace would remember, what she would share with her own children and grandchildren. I went to Texas looking for a new life, but what I found was so much more. I found home. I found love. I found Will. And in finding him, I found myself. May you all be so blessed. Their graves lay side by side in the Fort Stockton Cemetery under an old oak tree. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and the years of their lives. But to those who had known them, who had witnessed the depth of their devotion to each other, those stones represented so much more. They represented a love story that had begun with gunshots and fear and had ended with peace and contentment. They represented two lives so thoroughly intertwined that they could hardly be spoken of separately. The cabin still stood for many years after, eventually becoming a cherished place for family gatherings. The spring where Will had proposed became a favorite spot for his descendants, a place where multiple generations would come to swim and picnic and remember the man who had protected that land and the woman who had helped him build a legacy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light was just right, people swore they could see two figures sitting by that spring, a large, powerful man and a smaller woman leaning against him, just sitting together, watching the sunset, content in each other's presence for all eternity. The Stagecoach robbery had been a moment of violence and fear, three desperate men trying to salvage a failed plan. But from that moment had come something beautiful and lasting. Will Thorne had taken their guns and set Diana free, not just from immediate danger, but from a life that had been too small for her spirit. And she, in turn, had freed him from loneliness, had shown him that strength was not about standing alone, but about standing together. Their love story became the kind that mothers told their daughters and fathers told their sons. Not because it was perfect, it was not, but because it was real. Because it proved that the best things in life often came when you least expected them, when you were brave enough to take a chance, when you chose love, even when it seemed impractical or impossible. Fort Stockton itself grew and changed over the decades. The old fort buildings eventually crumbled, new businesses opened and closed, technology advanced and the world moved forward. But the story of Will and Diana remained constant, a touchstone for the community. The schoolhouse where Diana had taught still stood, though it was now a museum. The spot where they had built their cabin was marked with a historical plaque. Their great-great-grandchildren would eventually scatter across the country, but they all carried pieces of Will and Diana with them. James's descendants inherited Will's quiet strength and his respect for the land. Grace's children and grandchildren became teachers and caregivers, carrying on Diana's legacy of nurturing minds and hearts. All of them grew up hearing the story of how their ancestors met, how love had bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances. And sometimes, when those descendants faced their own difficult choices, their own moments of fear or uncertainty, they would remember the story. They would think of Diana choosing to leave everything familiar behind for a new life. They would think of Will stepping out from the rocks to face down three armed men because it was the right thing to do. They would think of both of them choosing each other, despite all the logical reasons not to. And they would find courage. That, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. Not the land or the buildings or even the romantic story, but the example they had set. The proof that love was worth fighting for, that integrity mattered, that being true to yourself was more important than meeting others' expectations, that sometimes the best path forward was the one nobody else understood. On the 100th anniversary of their wedding, the town of Fort Stockton held a celebration. Dozens of their descendants gathered, along with townspeople who remembered the stories their own grandparents had told. There were speeches and a historical presentation. The museum at the old schoolhouse opened a special exhibit about Diana's teaching career and Will's contributions to the community. But the most moving moment came at the end of the day, when the entire group walked out to the cemetery. They stood around Will and Diana's graves, now weathered by a century of Texas sun and wind, and someone began to sing. It was an old hymn, one Diana had loved. Others joined in, their voices rising into the evening air. And as the sun set over the land that Will had loved and Diana had learned to love, casting everything in gold and amber light, it felt like a benediction, like a confirmation that their story mattered, that their love had made a difference. that the choices they made on that dusty trail so long ago had rippled out through time in ways they never could have imagined. The stagecoach had been boarded by robbers who had lost their train. The mountain man had taken their guns and set her free. But more than that, so much more, he had freed her heart, and she had freed his. And from that freedom had come a lifetime of love, a family that spanned generations, and a story that would never truly end as long as there were people to tell it, to remember it, to let it inspire them to be brave in their own lives. That was the real magic of Will and Diana's story. Not that it was perfect or easy, but that it was true. That it proved love could conquer obstacles, that different worlds could merge and create something beautiful, that taking a risk on another person could be the best decision you ever made. As the last notes of the hymn faded and people began to drift away, one of Diana's great-great-granddaughters lingered. She was young, probably about the same age Diana had been when she first came to Texas. She stood looking at the graves for a long moment, then pulled a small notebook from her pocket and began to write. She was documenting the family history she had told everyone, making sure the story was preserved for future generations. But as she wrote, she found herself thinking about her own life, her own fears and dreams and choices. She had been offered a job in a city far from home. She had been scared to take it, worried about leaving everything familiar behind. But standing here, thinking about Diana who had done exactly that, she felt her fear begin to transform into excitement. Diana had taken a chance and found Will. Maybe, the young woman thought, maybe it was time to take her own chance. Maybe somewhere out there was her own story waiting to begin. She touched the top of Diana's gravestone gently, a silent thank you to a woman she had never met but whose courage had shaped her family for generations. Then she closed her notebook, took a deep breath, and walked toward her future. Behind her the sun finished setting and the stars began to emerge. The same stars that had watched over a stagecoach robbery turned rescue. The same stars that had witnessed a mountain man and a schoolteacher fall in love against all odds. The same stars that would keep watching as new stories unfolded, as new love bloomed, as life continued in all its messy, beautiful, complicated glory. The wind whispered through the old oak tree, and if you listened carefully, really listened, you might have heard the echo of laughter. Two voices, one deep and rumbling, one lighter and warmer, laughing together as they had done for so many years. Happy, together, forever. And that truly was the end of their story. But also in a way, it was just the beginning, because the best stories never really end. They live on in the hearts and choices of everyone they touch. They become part of the collective memory, the shared understanding of what it means to love and be loved. Will Thorne and Diana Dawson had lived and loved and built something that lasted. They had faced challenges and overcome them together. They had created a family and a legacy that continued long after they were gone. And they had proved beyond any doubt that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. All because of a stagecoach, a robbery, and a mountain man who chose to intervene. All because of a schoolteacher who chose to see beyond appearances to the man underneath. All because two people, so different on the surface, recognized in each other the thing they needed most, a partner, a lover, a friend, a home. Their story was complete, their love was eternal, and the land they had cherished continued on, holding their memory safe, passing their legacy forward, ensuring that what they had built together would never truly be lost. The stagecoach was boarded by robbers who had lost their train. The mountain man took their guns and set her free. And from that moment of fear and violence came a love story for the ages, a testament to courage, faith, and the transformative power of choosing to see the best in someone else. Will and Diana Thorne lived, loved, and left the world better than they found it. And that, in the end, is all any of us can hope to do.